Today, the theme for our service is nurture. I'm thinking about family, which we will be doing. First of all, I want to quote from Desmond Tutu, who I will be concluding this address with. I will top and tail it with Tutu. Listen to these words. Nobody comes into the world fully formed. We would not know how to think or walk or speak or behave as human beings unless we learned it from other human beings. We need other human beings in order to be human. I am because other people are. A person is entitled to a stable community life, and the first of these communities, says Desmond Tutu, is the family. There's much talk at the moment about the family. It's around right now, and it seems to be central to the whole debate right now about marriage equality. Many of the proponents of the No campaign in the marriage equality debate, that legalizing gay partnerships somehow, we are told, undermines the family. I believe quite the contrary to that. If a family is where people come together in a stable, permanent relationship and provide loving, caring homes for children, then marriage equality enhances the permanency of that. It doesn't threaten it. What it does do is remind us that at least 50% of all so-called straight marriages end in divorce. That there is serious domestic violence within at least 1 in 3 of all men and women marriages. That 1 in 4 of all children are living in a single-parent family, often where that lone parent is struggling. I believe in family, I do. But as we've heard from Jane this morning, it's often not the classical mum and dad family that we see in the television commercials. One of Mirabeau's slogans that Jane referred to is that every child deserves a childhood. And with respect, Jane, I'd like to add to that, I'm sure you'll agree with me, I want to expand it a bit and to say that every child deserves a family, if I am able to redefine the concept of family. So I want, therefore, briefly to consider what are the essential elements for family. There's loads of them, I'll just pick out a few. First of all, it's security. A landmark report published in 2000 by the Committee on Integrating the Science of Childhood Development identified how crucial security is in the development of children. Indeed, the main predictor of how well children will do in later life is reflected in how strong that secure bond is between the child and its primary caretaker. And that primary caretaker could be the actual parent or not. Note, this is not dependent upon a biological connection. It's all about bonding with a key person and offering and providing and giving and living within secure relationships. Security. Secondly, trust. Sociologist Erik Erikson suggests that trust is learnt early on in life. He says it is the first crisis that a child has to overcome. The question at this stage is, can the child trust his or her caregivers? And if the answer is yes, then they develop a sense of security and gradually accept that even when there's nobody in sight, they are secure. Abandonment by the caregiver can lead to a deep-seated fear that damages that ability to trust. Next, hope. In its report, Children's Fears, Hopes and Heroes, produced by the Australian Childhood Foundation, it describes overwhelmingly how a substantial proportion of children feel insecure. 46% of the children surveyed do not feel confident about the future, with another total of 42% of those children falling into a category what we call worried. 42% of all those children are in some way worried. And then the last 10% are what they call children who are disconnected and insular. And this last group in particular showed signs of enormous vulnerability and are most likely to be set on an early trajectory of hopelessness and despair. So these are the absolute essentials for strong family and nurture. Security, trust, hope, and there's another one, belonging. All children need to feel that their world is safe, where people care about them, where their needs for support, respect, and friendship will be met, and where they'll have the opportunity to work out any problems or difficulties that they have. All these are only possible within an atmosphere of belonging. Children must feel as though they are part of something bigger to which they belong. And it's interesting, Jane and I didn't collude on this, but all those 4 words Jane used in her presentation at breakfast this morning. All those things are essential elements of what the Mirabel Foundation brings to the most vulnerable of children. But they apply to all children. Of course they do. I don't know if you've seen it yet. I went to see a movie last week, Victoria and Abdul. I recommend it to you. In St. Michael's, we have a film group. Put it on their list. It's a lovely, lovely movie with... You're good. We've already got one person who's seen it. And Queen Victoria is played by Judi Dench, of course, one of the fabulous actresses in the world. And that's right, mate. And you will know that Queen Victoria had a big family. She's quoted in the film accurately because I read it elsewhere. She says, "I have 9 children, and I don't like any of them, and they don't like me." And that's right. And whilst they had fabulous wealth and prestige, what they didn't have were those things that I've just described. They didn't have that relationship. And we know from their diaries that they lived, even though, despite everything one would have thought they had in the world, they had pretty miserable lives. Now, what Victoria did do was, and it was something that was considered quite bizarre, you can imagine, by the royal household. She developed a relationship with a young Indian Muslim, Abdul, and to him, As a young man, she brought security, trust, hope, and belonging. She brought this into the life of this young Indian peasant, transforming his life until she died. And what I really liked about that story was the way that two people from unbelievably different backgrounds were able to cross huge boundaries to relate to each other, to think outside the square. And this is what Jane's organization does every single day. It's central to the life of that organization, and dare I say it this morning, it's central to the life of the ministry of this Jewish peasant, Jesus of Nazareth. He was consistently breaking down barriers and thinking outside the square. And so, therefore, it's appropriate today, on this, our day, that we celebrate this here in this church, because that is what we are charged with. We are charged, firstly, with breaking down the boundaries of tradition and mythology which has been built up in the church for centuries. We are charged to understand the Bible, not as some divine oracle dropped from heaven, which we blindly and literally follow, but as a collection of writings compiled over thousands of years, some beautiful, some profound, some historical, some mythical, some terrible. Now that's breaking through tradition. That's the first thing that we do in this church. Secondly, we are charged with breaking through traditional and nonsensical concepts of a distant, judging God who runs the world like some plaything and who can reward and punish at will. Thirdly, we are charged with breaking nonsense theology, like the bread and the wine in our communion actually becoming the body and blood of Christ, and even the bloodthirsty, archaic concept that somehow Jesus had to die a long and painful death for our sins. No, we're charged with breaking that stuff down. And we are charged to question the church's outdated practices that have been protecting the institution and its leadership for centuries, like the patriarchal obscenity of putting women second, like the absurd notion that homosexual is sinful, like meaningless rituals that are often unintelligible but somehow suggest some special relationship with an external God, like the superiority that we have as Christians, we claim often, which places us higher up the other order of faiths. Somehow we're bigger and better. And somehow that we are on our way to hell unless we put our hand up for some allegiance to this faith. Unless we put our hand up for our allegiance to Jesus of Nazareth, who spent his whole life destroying absurdities such as those. And even when he welcomed the children, think about this. This was a common daily request to rabbis to bless the children. And they would have done so in their day in a rather distant manner. They would just bless the children. It was part of what happened in everyday life. People would want their children to be brought to the rabbi to be blessed, and that's lovely and beautiful. The disciples shooed the mums away. Oh, our rabbi is much more important. Our rabbi is very busy. Our rabbi has really got other things to think about than kids. No. Jesus in St. Mark's Gospel that we read says it all. Matthew's Gospel says he just placed his hands on them and blessed them, just as the rabbis would have done. And Matthew would have wanted to convey that to his Jewish readers. But no, Mark has no such limitations, and writing his gospel 20 years before Matthew's gospel was written, maybe is much nearer the truth. He says, don't push these kids away. Don't ever get between them and me. These children are at the very center of the kingdom. And when you go home and you dust off your Bible, just compare the different versions of the same story in the Gospels. And only in Mark, the earliest and probably the most accurate, only in Mark does it say, Jesus then gathered the children in his arms. There's a difference. There's a difference between just blessing the children and putting his arms around them. This is Jesus embracing those kids. Most unusual. One of our biblical scholars, Professor Burkett, writes in The Gospel History and Its Transmission, he says, I cannot find anywhere in the early Christian literature the slightest sympathy towards the young. And yet here is Jesus of Nazareth holding them in his arms, changing the whole way of doing things in the attitude. For over 150 years, this church here in St. Michael's has been the beacon of religious independence in this city, nurturing and growing people so that their faith and social values are relevant to the life in this city and beyond. This church has encouraged free thinking, hope, and provided a secure place for people to live and think. This church has been a place where their people trust each other, belong to each other. And despite a whole range of different sorts of beliefs, of culture, of education, of sexuality, of age, of status, or even what team you barrack for, we still are one. We still are one. Many years ago, when I was working with the street gang in Glasgow that many of you have heard me recall before, I was standing late at night outside the church where I was working. By this stage, I developed a relationship with the leadership of some of the street kids there. And these are kids, violent, aggressive kids in and out of jail. And I'm standing there talking to them, 11 o'clock at night, and an old car skids up in front of us. And out of it gets 3 or 4 kids from another gang, not ours, from a visiting gang in another neighborhood. And that was where most of the violence would occur, from gang to gang. And the biggest and ugliest of them all came up to me. And he was brandishing a big knife in one hand and a cutthroat razor in the other. And he came up to me and he said to me, "Are you Chick?" And I said, No, I'm not Chick, I'm Rick. And he said, "You look like Chick to me." No, you got the wrong bloke there. I'm Rick. He got closer and closer and closer. And Gok, who was the leader of the gang that I was with, leaning on the wall at the time, as he got close and with his weapons towards me because he was out for this bloke, I thought my end had come, let me tell you. He got closer and closer, and Gok said, and I'll miss out the language, as it is Sunday morning, he got closer and closer, and Gok said, "He's not Chick. He's Rick. He's the minister. He's one of us." At which point, this big, hairy, horrible brute of a bloke, "The minister?" "Well, yes." "Oh, minister," they said, "I'm awfully sorry. Mistaken identity. Now, you will forgive us, won't you?" No worry, boys, you're fine. Well, can you give us a forgiveness? Okay, you're forgiven. Good. Oh, thanks. Do you see what I mean? What was the most important thing there was what Gok said. He's one of us. The hugely vulnerable children that Jane embraces every day are one of us. The fragile and infirmed people who can no longer come to our church because of their health and infirmity, they're one of us. The poor, mean men and women who scratch out an existence on the pavements just outside our church every day of the week are one of us. People of different cultures and backgrounds, of different sexualities, poor and rich, people who have or people who have not, people who are being prosecuted, old, young, black, white, even Collingwood supporters. They're all one of us. And we claim them and belong to them, and they us. And we celebrate that today, just as we celebrate the Jane Rose of this world, who reach out and embrace struggling kids in the spirit of that Nazarene peasant who changed the world. We reach out just as he did. I conclude, as I said I was going to, with another quote from Desmond Tutu. We are made for goodness. We are made for love. We are made for friendliness. We are made for togetherness. We are made for all the beautiful things that you and I know. We are made to tell the world that there are no outsiders. All are welcome. He says, black, white, red, yellow, rich, poor, educated, not educated, male, female, gay, straight, all. We all belong to this family, this human family, and God's family. This is St. Michael's then, now, and will be. Amen. And so go today in the spirit of St. Michael to quell the dragons of inequality, the dragons of violence and destruction. Go with the sword of love, of joy and peace, and the power of the Spirit to proclaim and to live righteousness.